Good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Codi, the Executive Director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we sit down with faith leaders, social justice practitioners, and academics to talk at the intersections of faith, climate, and justice. And this morning we have on a very special guest, the Reverend Senator Kim Jackson. Senator, thank you so much for taking some time to be with us this morning.
Oh, good morning. It's good to be with you, Codi.
So before we get started, tell us briefly a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are.
Yeah, so I am the Reverend Senator Kim Jackson, and so those two titles should give you a little bit of a hint that I am ordained. I'm an ordained clergy person in the Episcopal Church, and then I am a state senator serving here in Georgia. I represent areas of DeKalb County and Gwinnett County. Most notably, perhaps, or the bigger cities would be the cities of Stone Mountain, Clarkston, and Tucker. And then I have some of the unincorporated areas that exist in both DeKalb and Gwinnett County.
That's great. Thanks again for being with us. And I think to get us started, you've got a little bit of a reading to ground us. So I'll ask you to offer that this morning.
I do. So this reading, it's a poem, and it comes from the author is Ross Gay. So here it is. A small needful fact is that Eric Gardner worked for some time at the Parks and Recs Department, the horticultural department, which means perhaps that with his very large hands, perhaps, and in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants which most likely, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to grow, continue to do what plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe.
That's so good. It's beautiful. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
What about that kind of speaks to you, and why did you choose it for today?
Yeah, I wanted to choose a reading that kind of hit at all these different intersections that I find myself standing in. So as a Black woman who has worked on the front lines as a protest chaplain in the Black Lives Matter movement, I've chanted that phrase so many times, I can't breathe. I can't tell you how many times I've said that in crowds and crowds of people. And certainly the story of the life, and more, I think probably more notably the passing of Eric Gardner, has been a story that has really transformed, I think, the way that America talks about issues of race. And as a person who is a multi-generation Black farmer who lives on a hobby farm of my own, I grow and plant things. I think it's really important to speak to those intersections of where justice, and racial justice in particular, intersects with the very air that we breathe, right? This notion, what we see when we hear the story of Eric Gardner is, we see this large Black kind of teddy bear of a man who gets wrestled down by police officers. And that's the image I think we're often left with for him. But to reimagine that and to think about his large, beautiful, dark hands, the color of soil, planting life that ultimately helps us all be able to breathe easier. I just felt like it's so accurate, right? It's not just the plants that he planted that help us breathe easier, but it's also all of the racial justice work that's come out of it, the police reform that's come out of his death, that ultimately I hope will help us all breathe better.
Yeah, you are an incredibly intersectional human being, both in your work and your life. And so I wonder if we could start a little bit by talking about your faith journey, how you came to your tradition, how you came to your calling, and how that kind of plays out in your work now.
Yeah. So I knew that I was called to be a pastor when I was just 8 years old. I think I did some really kind of simple third grade math. I had this real clear feeling or calling in my life that God called me to like make a positive impact on people. And so I did third grade math, which says, okay, here are the people who've made an impact in my life. My parents, well, you only get to have like somewhere between 2 and I don't know, 5 kids or something, right? So that's not very many people. And then I was like, my teachers, and I'm just like, well, there are only 20 kids in a classroom. Again, I'm a third grader, so forgive my not ability to see, think longevity. And then I was like, and then there's my pastor. And my pastor, I'm like, well, you could have a congregation of like basically an unlimited amount of people, was kind of my conclusion. And so that third grade math made me feel really clear. And in fact, I went and talked to my parents about it and talked to my pastor and said, like, I'm called to be a pastor. And obviously I had to flesh that out, and I had to develop something beyond just the third grade reason. But I think the core of that calling, which was to make positive impact on the world, it was right. And it was spot on. And so I was raised Baptist in a tradition that would not ordain women. So I had to find a new church home. In the process, I also came out as a queer woman. And so that narrowed my options a little bit in the early 2000s. But, when I came to the Episcopal Church, I arrived having literally followed the signs. There are these signs that say the Episcopal Church welcomes you, and there's an arrow.
Yeah.
Well, I followed those signs from Emory University, and they took me to St. Bart's Episcopal Church, which could not be any more different from the kind of church I grew up in. I mean, it was majority, like overwhelmingly white, smells, bells, all these like fancy clothes, and organ, not a Black church organ, like big, huge organ. I mean, it was so foreign, like 100% foreign to me. And yet that very first Sunday that I arrived, when we all stood up to do what I now know is called the Eucharist, but what I would have called then is communion, there was something deep in my soul that just felt at home. And there was nothing about that moment that felt foreign. It all felt like deeply, almost like ancestrally familiar to me. And that's when I knew this is the space. This is where I can be who I am. And it's been true. I think that I kind of stumbled across a denomination and a diocese that really has welcomed and embraced me and my own sense of calling, which has been incredibly intersectional in and of itself, right? When I went through the ordination process, they asked me, like, what kind of priest do you want to be? And I was 23 years old at the time. And I said, well, I hope I'm going to get to be a priest for a long time. And I think I want to be a lot of different kinds of priests. And that included from college chaplaincy, which I did for 5 years, to a traditional parish priest, which I've also done, to now I get to serve a congregation of people who are experiencing homelessness while also working at the Capitol. And so I have been able to be this kind of eclectic Jill of all trades, if you will, in the Episcopal Church, very much following after that 8-year-old call to try to make a positive impact on the world.
Yeah, it's great. As a person who is, I would say, loosely Baptist, going to Park Avenue and reclaiming some progressive Baptist roots for myself, I wonder for you as a person who, grew up in the Black Baptist church and then moved over to the Episcopal Church, are there pieces of your Baptist life that you feel like flare up at times that have stayed with you?
Oh, absolutely. The music, I played the piano when I was a kid in the Black Baptist church. And so that music is like in my bones. It still is a source of joy, a source of comfort for me. And I also think that some Baptists who are listening may disagree with me about this, but I think that the Baptist church actually has this rich tradition of being in conflict and figuring out how to continue to be church, but in different places. So schism has been a hallmark of the Baptist church. And that kind of conflict, therefore, doesn't scare me. I think that's really interesting. Like, as I think about my work now in the Senate, like conflict is kind of at the heart of politics. And I do think it's my Baptist upbringing that does have a certain amount of comfortability with conflict and understanding that schism isn't inherently terrible. That helps me navigate that space.
What do you say to the people who kind of take the position of, you're a clergy person or you're a politician, but you really don't have any business mixing, ministry with policy making or vice versa?
Yeah. Well, I will say this. I think that there's no way that we can elect human beings who come in without some type of formation that is informed by their spiritual, ethical, moral compass. I mean, that would be electing robots. So we all, right? Like we all bring that with us. What I'm clear about is I have some boundaries. I don't preach at the Senate. I don't seek to impose my religious laws on the people of Georgia. The example I like to give all the time is I'm married to a Muslim. And so in our house, we don't eat pork. But I will tell you now, you will never see this senator introduce legislation that would ban pork, right? From Georgians being able to eat it. And so I actually think that because I am not only a clergy person, but I'm a trained theologian, that I'm actually able to make those distinctions between church and state in a way that's much more thoughtful than some of my other colleagues down at the Senate. You're not going to ever see me stand up and do a Bible study in the well, which there's some others of my colleagues who would be quick to do that. So I think that, and I think it's just fundamentally important that the people's house represents the people. And that's across all vocations, right? Like we are a better Senate because we have doctors. We are a better Senate because we have people who've been teachers, who've been lawyers. And I believe fundamentally that we are a better Senate because we have pastors. That is a part of the Georgia population.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about, you said you're not only a clergy person, you're a trained theologian, and you are quite literally, the embodiment of what a public theologian can and should be. And here at GIPL, we talk a lot about how people of faith and faith leaders need to get engaged in the work of policymaking, because that's where we rectify systemic injustices. And there aren't a lot of ways to do that other than getting involved in policymaking. And so I wonder for you, as a person who claims to be a public theologian and is sitting at this really unique nexus between the church and policymaking, how do you think about that? What's your framing, and what would you say to people of faith and faith leaders who are doing this work?
Yeah, I think I would echo what you've named, Cody, is that if you want to make systemic change in the world, which I actually think as a Christian, that's what we're called to do. If you want to live out the gospel, which calls us to set the captive free, to preach good news, to proclaim liberation, then the only way you can do that effectively in these United States and the governmental system that we have set up is by engaging with policy. And so I think that as people of faith, that's, and particularly as Christians, those of us who are Christians, that is a part of our responsibility. And so I strive to do that in a way, again, that's not, that's rooted and grounded in a certain moral compass that I bring, right? Like the gospel certainly informs all that I do. I take seriously when I was sick, you visited me, but also Jesus's actions of when he encountered people who were sick, he brought them healing. I take that really seriously and try to make sure that we expand Medicaid so we can help heal some people, right? Sure. And so I think that's the work that we're called to do, is to try to apply some of these greater Christian principles. This isn't about like saving souls and keeping people from out of hell. This is about the stuff that I think that our Christian faith and other faiths call us to do, which has to do with engagement with one another. It's about how we be neighbor to one another, right? Every religious group has something that says something to the effect of do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. And so trying to live those values out and create a world, or specifically a city or county or state government where we live into that principle, I think that fundamentally will make us all better.
Yeah. How do you think about, environmental ethics, creation care, creation theology, where you're sitting kind of in the same nexus, and how does that influence how you think about, environmental protections and environmental justice when it comes to policymaking?
Yeah, so I think about it from a couple of different places. So one of my approaches is thinking about the ways that I believe, and I think there's actual real science around this, that we are all created from the earth, or in the Episcopal Church, we say, from dust, you're created of dust, and to dust you will return. That's a poor translation. We're made from probably some healthy, rich, micro dense soil, and therefore we will return to that. But we also therefore have a responsibility that we make sure that we care for the very soil from which we came from, and the very soil that gives us sustenance. So I think about that in terms of just who we are as enfleshed people. And also in this belief that I believe that God created us, right? And that God created not just us as humans, but all of the earth, from the waters to the skies and everything in between. And so as people who become responsible for trying to take care of, doing our part to take care of and to participate in this work of creation that God has invited us to participate in, then we have a responsibility to do that well, and to use all of the tools and resources that we have, including science, to do that work well, of caring for, making sure that we have clean air, clean water, clean soil, healthy soil, right? All of those pieces go into, I think, fundamentally living into our responsibility as co-creators with God in this work.
Yeah. Well, I know that you mentioned here that you come from a lineage of Black farmers and you're doing some farming yourself. And I know that working with Black farmers is a huge part of what you're trying to work on through legislation. And so I wonder if you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I do. I'm a multi-generation farmer. My parents farm, my aunts and uncles farm, and then I have what we call here a little hobby farm. And what we know, especially in Georgia, is that a lot of Black farmers lost their land, right, through systemic racism and injustice. And so the farmers that have been left here in Georgia, they're often small produce farmers. They're not large enough to do kind of that monoculture, large corn, large soy, which is probably a good thing. But they're produce farmers. They're actually the people who are putting food on our table, right, in the summer.
Yeah,
And
real food.
real food, like, the vegetables that taste good.
Yeah.
And so they need support because for so long, I mean, there's never been a time, quite frankly, in which Black farmers have received the support that they were entitled to in the same ways that white farmers have. And so that has been a real emphasis of mine. This year, I appropriated funds to go to Southwest Georgia to create a food hub. So one of the issues that farmers in general run into, and Black farmers specifically run into, is that it's really expensive to process your produce. So think about it, like when you go to the store, if you buy a whole watermelon, sure, no processing required. But if you buy a bag of collard greens, processing was required to get that bag, right, washed, desanded. If you ever get collard greens from the South, like true Southern Georgia, all that sand had to get desanded. They get washed, cut, chopped, and packed. And so that processing part is actually really expensive. And the materials, like the equipment to do that, is costly. So I helped appropriate funds so that we could create essentially a co-op where produce farmers in Southwest Georgia can share that equipment to be able to package their product and to get it to market. And that is a major issue that we see across the United States for smaller farmers, is that they need processing places. They need places where they can process in order to just get some clear margins. If they have to pay outright for all of the equipment to grow, then package, all that, then the margins, there are no margins there. And so I helped appropriate funds to try to help fix that gap. And also it's Southwest Georgia, where there's a significant food desert already. And so getting produce that's actually fresh grown there and then able to get to the schools in Southwest Georgia is a part of that project that I'm really happy to help appropriate, and we'll continue to work specifically around that issue in the coming up legislation as well.
That's really exciting. And surely those farms and farmers experience shortfalls because of natural disasters, flooding, hurricane winds, all sorts of things. So I would imagine that support's super important.
Yeah, that's right. They lose also as a result of like frankly just not having the good farming practices to be able to maintain the health of their soil. So that's another part of the money that I've appropriated. It will help to train these produce farmers in more sustainable practices so that their topsoil isn't being washed away and washed into our streams
Yeah.
and rivers, but they're able to keep that soil on their property and really develop it so that it's healthy, so they can create more healthy food.
Yeah, that's so important. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about an issue that GIPL and the Georgia Water Coalition and a lot of organizations have been working on for a long time, which is coal ash,
Yes.
specifically trying to get coal ash excavated out of the wet ponds that they're in and to be put in dry lined facilities. And right now, we're obviously in a really important period of time because currently EPD is beginning to roll out those permits for closing and capping in place some of these coal ash ponds. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it's been like dealing with that at the state capitol and what some of your
Mhm.
perspectives are on coal ash.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So, Cody, I've been elected, I've been serving for 8 months now.
Yeah.
So not a long time, but before I even was elected, I knew about the coal ash issue and had begun to do some research. And to me, it was pretty straightforward. Like, you have these poisonous ash that you have in the ground that seeps into the water and people drink water. And so therefore, like, it seemed really straightforward to me. Let's just line them, make everybody healthy and move on. But when I got down to the Capitol, I was disturbed to realize that it's not the solution is that simple, but there are many, many roadblocks that stand in the way that often boil down to money. And I've also, I don't know how much work you all have done around this, Cody, but I've been surprised by the amount of I would call it misinformation. Perhaps my colleagues would just call it contradicting information about the impact of coal ash on humans. And so, I've listened to some very smart people stand up and say, "Oh, well, there's no evidence that it hurts people," and I'm. And so that's been really surprising for me to hear, and I feel like there's a lot of great information to counter that, but folks aren't necessarily willing to hear it. Um, and then the other big question that keeps coming up around this issue is, okay, so if we force Georgia Power to excavate, line, and close these and dry lined, if we capture them in those dry lined ponds that are no longer ponds, then where does that cost go to? And the assumption is, well, of course it'll just go back to the Georgia Power payers, me and
Right.
you, regular people. And the fact that that is a far gone conclusion, like that is
Yeah.
acceptable answer, is really troublesome to me, because it doesn't have to be the answer. We do not actually have to push that cost back on the individual payer. Georgia Power
Yeah.
itself could take that cost on, but that conversation isn't happening in a way that I think is productive. I don't know. Does
Yeah.
that answer your question, Cody? There's a lot. There's a lot to
Absolutely.
this
Yeah.
conversation.
There's a lot to it. I mean, I would say for the people who don't believe that there's any impacts, there's a beautiful film produced in part by Altamaha Riverkeeper called Saving Juliet, which just talks about, the story around Planchera's coal ash pond in that community. And, I would dare anyone to talk to anybody in that community and say that there hasn't been any impacts from coal ash, you know. And the other thing I would say is on your ratepayer question and comment is, yeah, I mean, we, we don't have to take an already burdened group of people and make them pay for even more cleanup,
Right.
you know? Yeah.
Right. And as somebody who thinks a lot about racial justice and thinks specifically about the impacts of poverty on outcomes for people who live in Georgia, the idea that we as payers, ratepayers, would have to pay for that cleanup is absurd, because I recognize that creates an undue burden on people who are already struggling. I mean, there's so many people, and this is one of the things I get to do as a legislator is I get the great privilege of calling Georgia Power and asking them to not turn somebody's power off for 2 weeks so that they have time to come up with the money. Right. That's a part of the work as the legislator that I get to do. And so people are already struggling. And then to add that to them doesn't make sense when we're dealing with a multi-million-dollar corporation.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask too about, there are a lot of levers in government. There's local, state, and federal, and there's obviously been a lot of federal conversation both around an infrastructure package and also big, bold investments in climate and climate solutions. And I wonder if you could talk about what a federal investment in those types of things could look like in Georgia and how that would impact, everyday Georgians.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the things I think we can look forward to is really helping to develop our mass transit. So not just for the Metro Atlanta, like Atlanta specific DeKalb and Fulton counties, but true infrastructure. Will also expand to Gwinnett County, which is our second largest county in the state, Gwinnett County, which I happen to also represent. So bringing some mass transit out there will have some significant help. I think that also there's some work that the federal government will be able to help us do when it comes to also just ensuring that our so let's talk about DeKalb County sewage systems. So DeKalb County gets a lot of attention for its failure to adequately update our sewage systems. And therefore we have like hundreds of thousands of gallons of sewage that gets seeped into our rivers every time there's a large rain, right? So we know that about DeKalb County because that's been talked about, but the reality is all across Georgia, you have cities and counties with failing sewage systems that need to be invested in so that they don't create a DeKalb County size problem. And so federal dollars that can come down to help with that will be really important. And I think this is something we don't talk about as much, but our dams in Georgia, DAMS,
we have a lot of them.
We have
a lot of them are in disrepair.
A lot of them, they're very old and very, very not well kept up. And so there are cities, small cities, usually small towns, that are literally sitting ducks, just waiting for that one breach in the dam. And we really are in need. I mean, this is actually, it's an urgent need that we have. And I think federal dollars being poured in will be able to help to, I mean, really to save some towns, to keep them from being flooded over. And certainly there are a number of individual residences and houses that would be protected if we were able to update our dams.
Yeah. Well, Senator, thank you so much for taking some of your time to come on the show. I wanted to ask you as a last question, for people who are interested in trying to push forward change, through policy and to work with their legislators, what advice would you give to, individuals of faith and faith leaders doing this work?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think it's important for people to be direct with their legislators and saying, like, I speak as a person of faith, and like not let that be something that's secret or feel like it's actually important. It's compelling when legislators hear that you're a faith leader, a person of faith, because almost all of us, there are 56 legislators, 55 of us identify as people of faith. And so when we hear that that's who you are and what you're representing, it's helpful. So don't hide that. Don't bury that lead. And then also reach out to your legislators and do it in the off season. So like not just between January and March when we are the busiest and being the most pulled upon, but reach out to your legislators and legislators of who would be interested in this, right? So it's not just if you live in the metro area, like you don't have to just reach out to the metro folks. You can reach out to the chair of the Ag Committee or Department of Natural Resources during the off season and offer to drive down to Perry or Jackson or wherever these folks live and meet with them. Call their offices. You'll have much better response likelihood if you call versus sending an email. But just be willing to have a cup of coffee, right? Which is what we're doing here, or something stronger.
Yeah.
with legislators, and tell them what the problems are and what you're trying to address, and also name that you represent people of faith, and that there are other people who for every one voice that you bring 10 people with you, or 20 people, or if you're leading a mosque and you got a mosque of 250 people, like say that I speak and I bring 250 voices with me, because it's really compelling and it's helpful. And just remember, like, we are human beings. We're just regular people. So having a good cup of coffee with somebody to learn about their issues is a really accessible way to do it.
Well, thank you so much, Senator, for coming on, and everyone who's watching. You heard it here first. go have coffee or something stronger with a legislator and get to know them and talk about what's important to you and your issues. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.
All right, thanks, Cody.